I was in a comment section the other day. I know, my first mistake is on a video from NASA. Just some beautiful new footage from the James Webb Telescope. Deep in the replies under a comment about, human ingenuity, someone had posted just 6 words. Too bad the moon landing was fake. And just instantly the fire started. But what was so fascinating wasn't the original comment. It was the reaction. You had one group piling on, posting links, look at the shadows, or the flag is waving sheeple. They were excited, almost joyful, like they were sharing this profound secret. They weren't just stating a fact. They were finding their team. Then you had the other side, just as emotional, but with pure outrage. Are you serious? Go read a physics book. Yeah. And they were posting counter arguments, encyclopedia entries, just getting angrier and angrier with every reply. But here's the thing. Nobody was changing their mind. The algorithm was loving it, of course, pushing the whole chaotic argument right to the top. And watching these two sides, both 100% convinced they were saving the world, one with the real truth and the other with the actual facts, it made me realize something. The debate isn't about facts anymore. It's about identity, strategy, and systems. So that's our mission for this deep dive. We are looking beyond simply defining what is fake. We need to unpack the 3 powerful forces driving this proliferation of resonant misinformation today: the strategic, the psychological, and of course, the technological. We need to understand why we accept these stories and how the modern systems push them on us.
That moon landing example is a perfect historical entry point because it really does start with the strategic. We have to look at something called active measures, or in Russian, aktivny meropryatия. This is a term for political warfare used by Soviet and then Russian security services, the Cheka, KGB, FSB, and it dates all the way back to the 1920s.
Now, when we hear intelligence services, most people think espionage, spies stealing blueprints.
Yeah.
How is this different? Why is that distinction so crucial for what we're talking about today?
It's a fundamental difference in the objective. Espionage is primarily about getting information. Active measures is about subversion. It's about using that information, or more often fabricated information, to manipulate the other side's domestic politics and cause them to act against their own interests. It's political warfare. It's designed to create chaos and mistrust, not just to gather secrets.
So it's offensive, not defensive.
Exactly. A retired KGB Major General, Oleg Kalugin, he called active measures the heart and soul of Soviet intelligence. Their goal wasn't just intelligence collection. It was always, and I'm quoting here, to weaken the West, to drive wedges in the Western community, and to foment discord among allies, particularly within NATO.
And that strategic goal provides the exact context for that moon landing debate. I mean, when the U.S. pulled off Apollo 11 in 1969, that was a massive propaganda loss for the Soviets in the space race.
Precisely. The Cold War provided the ultimate motivation. The goal of pushing a moon landing hoax wasn't necessarily to scientifically prove it was fake. It was strategically effective political warfare. It was designed to degrade your rival's prestige, to chip away at their global triumph. The narrative was designed to make perfect sense to anyone already conditioned to see the U.S. as theatrical and deceptive.
And speaking of deception, this is actually where we get the term that defines so much this: disinformation.
Yes, desinformation, that's the Russian word. It's claimed that Joseph Stalin himself coined the term back in 1923. And what's truly fascinating is that he gave it a French-sounding name, Disinformation, specifically to trick other nations into believing the practice actually started in the West.
Wow.
Think about that level of long-term strategic deception, coining a term specifically to plant a false origin story. That right there, that commitment to narrative warfare, it defined the early tactics.
And the archives show just how wide-ranging these operations were, all aimed at fostering distrust in Western institutions. It wasn't just about space, it was about society itself. They planted claims, for example, that the CIA assassinated both John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr.
And maybe the most notorious example, the one that targeted public health, was Operation Infection. That campaign spread the complete fabrication that the AIDS virus was manufactured by U.S. scientists at Fort Detrick. It ran for years across the globe, creating tremendous fear and political tension before it was officially confirmed as a Soviet disinformation campaign in the early 90s.
Okay, so that's the Cold War strategy, targeting newspapers, planting rumors, classic intelligence stuff. But how does that translate to the 21st century? The tools have completely changed.
The tactical playbook is the same, but the delivery system is industrialized. The modern insight is that active measures don't need difficult physical espionage anymore. They're conducted online. Every social media user is a potential tactical battlefield for subversion.
So groups like the IRA, the Internet Research Agency.
Exactly. Post-1991, you have state actors like the Kremlin-affiliated IRA, and they're devoted entirely to online information operations. The objective is still to foment political gridlock and create mistrust in institutions. During the 2016 U.S. election, for example, content made by the IRA reached at least 126 million U.S. Facebook users.
But if their goal is just chaos to undermine the system, does that make them nonpartisan, or are they just trying to turn Americans against the whole system itself, regardless of party?
That's the key strategic nuance. The goal is to exacerbate existing internal divisions. If they see a vulnerable fissure on the political left, they push content there. If they see an emotionally potent division on the right, they push there. It's about maximizing internal conflict. It's not about promoting one candidate. It's about making the entire democratic process seem illegitimate, unreliable, and just hopelessly divided.
So it's a strategic weapon aimed directly at the individual mind. And that brings us, I think, pretty seamlessly to our second force, the inner battle, the psychology of conviction.
We often assume people believe misinformation because they just lack facts. It's the so-called deficit model. But what the stories suggest is that something far more powerful is at play. Belief isn't always about accuracy, it's about affirmation.
Let's think back to the story of David, the man whose factory was closing. The official reports, the dry, evidence-based reports about global logistics and automation, they told him a story he couldn't process, that he was, economically obsolete.
And that conclusion was devastating. It left him feeling powerless, invisible. So when the facts feel bad, people seek a better narrative. And David found one online. A fake story claiming the closure was a deliberate, coordinated attack by coastal elites to punish the heartland.
That story, even though it was evidence-free, was incredibly potent. It transformed him. He was no longer a victim of economic forces. He was a righteous victim, a warrior in a cultural battle. That narrative felt more true than the corporate filings because it affirmed his identity and gave his pain meaning.
And that is a perfect example of motivated reasoning in action. It's the psychological tendency to filter information, to accept news that aligns with our existing worldviews and identity, regardless of where it comes from. We are motivated, literally, to arrive at conclusions that reinforce who we already think we are.
So it's not just what you know, it's who you are, politically and culturally, that dictates what you'll accept.
Exactly. And this principle was validated in a really powerful psychological study out of Hungary, which is a nation dealing with high political polarization and low media trust. The researchers wanted to isolate which psychological factors truly predicted belief in fake news.
And what did they find?
Well, the findings really challenge our common assumptions. They looked at political orientation, so satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the government, and found it consistently predicted belief in news, both fake and real, but only when the content was congruent with that political identity.
You believe the stories that favor your team.
That's the core partisan bias, yes. But here's what truly deepens the dive. The strongest universal predictor. The most significant detail was that a conspiracy mentality was the only psychological predisposition consistently associated with believing all types of fake news, political and non-political. Whether the fake story was about a political scandal or a secret global cabal controlling the weather, that underlying tendency to believe in hidden plots was the critical driver.
Which supports that idea of ideological symmetry, ingullibility. It's not a left to right thing, it's a mindset.
Right. And they also saw the effect of something called system justification beliefs. Those participants who had a strong basic psychological need to validate the existing social arrangements, they were significantly more likely to endorse pro-government news, regardless of whether it was true or not. They are psychologically motivated to believe the system they live in is stable and just.
Wait, so all those hours spent reading encyclopedias or taking science classes that did nothing to protect someone like David from falling for the elite conspiracy theory. That's really counterintuitive.
It is. The study explicitly found that traditional intellectual competencies, things like objective political knowledge and scientific knowledge, did not protect participants against believing fake news. The deficit model fails. Facts just don't inoculate you if the competing narrative is emotionally resonant enough to affirm your identity and satisfy that underlying need for conspiracy or justification.
That brings us to the crucial pivot. We get the strategic goal, which is to exploit identity, and we know the mind is susceptible. But how does one emotionally resonant, bad story reach millions of susceptible minds instantly? That's where we turn to the third force, the amplifier, the machine itself.
And the machine takes that psychological vulnerability and just ruthlessly industrializes it. We see this so clearly in the story of Lucia, the 70-year-old grandmother. She started out innocently enough, just looking up gardening tips and maybe pausing for a second on alternative health content video.
But the algorithm wasn't designed to find her truth. It was designed to maximize her engagement. It registered that slight pause, that moment of curiosity, and just ruthlessly amplified the skepticism. First herbal cures, then virus origins, then anti-mask videos, and then finally full-blown conspiracy theories.
Within a short time, her feed became a self-reinforcing echo chamber. The algorithm drove her to refuse the vaccine and claim that doctors were lying. It wasn't making ethical judgments. It was just ruthlessly efficient at feeding her the emotionally potent, high-engagement content. It turned a curious moment into radicalization.
And this issue of algorithmic amplification is the core legal and technological challenge facing the U.S. today. And it all centers around Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. For people who aren't familiar with this foundational internet law, what was its original purpose?
Section 230, which was passed way back in 1996, is often summarized by two key clauses. One says platforms are not treated as the publisher or speaker of user-generated content, meaning they aren't legally liable for what a user posts. This was crucial for the early internet, allowing platforms to grow without being sued for every defamatory comment.
So it's a shield. It was created to foster free speech and let platforms moderate bad content without being held liable like a traditional publisher.
Exactly. But critics today argue that this shield allows platforms to evade responsibility for the algorithmic amplification. They aren't just hosting the content, they're actively recommending it and maximizing its reach to vulnerable users like Lucia, who are only slightly curious to begin with. The recommendation engine is the problem, not just the storage of the content.
And that tension has spurred bipartisan legislative action, like the proposed Algorithm Accountability Act. What would that do?
That legislation aims to pierce the Section 230 shield, specifically when algorithms are used to actively promote harmful content, content that incites violence, drives radicalization, or contributes to significant public harm.
So the focus is on the recommendation system.
The focus is squarely on redesigning the recommendation system itself. If the system is designed purely for engagement, regardless of harm, then the platform has to bear some responsibility for the outcome. You can contrast this with the European approach, which focuses more heavily on transparency. Under EU frameworks, social media companies are required to issue clear public statements of reasons or SORs whenever they restrict content.
And what does that mean for a user in practice?
It means if your content is taken down, the SOR has to include a specific reference to the law or policy that was violated. It ensures clarity about why the restriction happened. The efficacy is still debated. It doesn't necessarily prevent the content from being amplified in the first place, but it shifts the burden toward clarity and public rationale from the platform.
Ultimately, if U.S. reform passes, platforms may be forced to redesign their systems entirely, to prioritize safety over raw engagement. But there's a real complexity there. Defining harmful content without stifling legitimate innovation or critically impinging on free speech. It just shows how difficult it is to regulate the velocity of these systems.
Well, the challenge is that the most engaging, most emotionally potent content, the stuff that motivated reasoning loves, is often the most divisive and harmful. The algorithm is simply efficient at feeding the mind what it wants to believe, regardless of the consequences.
This has been a deeply interconnected deep dive into three worlds: the strategic, the psychological, and the technological. To recap for you, our listener, here are the three critical takeaways we've discussed. First, misinformation is fundamentally a strategic tool, weaponized by state actors historically, whether to discredit the moon landing or to exploit internal divisions in contemporary elections through industrialized digital operations like the IRA. Second, belief in these stories often stems from a deep psychological need for identity-affirming narratives, driven by a universal conspiracy mentality and partisan bias, which even high levels of objective knowledge fail to protect against. And third, this entire strategic and psychological vulnerability is turbocharged by engagement-driven algorithms, forcing a critical reckoning with platform accountability and the limits of Section 230.
The sheer velocity and global reach of these digital systems mean the line between an individual's internal conviction and global geopolitical influence has all but disappeared. This makes the individual search for truth more difficult than ever because the challenge is no longer just filtering out bad information, it's discerning when a deeply satisfying narrative is masquerading as reality.